All right, so in this video, I wanted to try something a little different. I've been getting requests to do more analysis. So in this video, I'm going to go over a few of Deleuze's concepts, some of his fundamental concepts, mostly from Thousand Plateaus, but found throughout his work. And then I'm going to read from Manuel DeLanda's Deleuze History and Science from the chapter entitled Metallic Assemblages, which discusses some of these concepts. Concepts that we'll be going over will be the assemblages, territorialization and deterritorialization, and the virtual and the actual is something that I'm just going to riff on a little bit here before we get into the text. So how can we understand this seemingly exotic concept that Deleuze and Guattari bring up in a lot of their work? So the actual and the virtual in terms of physics is a good way to concretize the concept. So in physics, you have particles. And what are particles? Particles are particulates. They are pieces of, they are actualizations of a field, right? So the field, let's say the Higgs-Boson. The Higgs-Boson is a particle that has been uncovered through the Large Hadron Collider. They did experiments there through the large particle accelerator that they have, where they accelerate protons at a very high rate of speed. And as they crash into each other, the event occurs. And the event is the capturing of the particle out of the collisions that happen in the Large Hadron Collider. So you can think of the actualization of the particle, the Higgs-Boson particle, from the Higgs field, right? So the particle is actualized in the event of the collision, right? So another kind of way to flesh it out, think of it in terms of the virtual is thought of as rhizomatic or made up of a multiplicity of intensities. The actual is more arborescent, so it's more hierarchical. So when the virtual is actualized, it takes the form of hierarchies that are visible and manifestable and are manifested in our environment for us to perceive and interact with. So if you can think of the actual, let's look at the mushroom, right? So the mushroom is the sprouted mushroom, the fruit, is the actualization of the virtual field of differential relations, which is the mycelium, right? The mycelium is the subterranean network of relationships, of movements of nutrients and chemicals. The mycelium interact with the dirt, the trees. They're constantly communicating, constantly moving information back and forth. And you can think of the mushroom sprouting and fruiting as the actualization of the virtual, the coming into being, the becoming mushroom of the mycelium. So the mycelium, again, rhizomatic, subterranean, networked, folded, bifurcated, underground network of relationships that give forth to what we call a mushroom. Now, they kind of see it and speak about it as the actualization being a sort of delimiting, a slowing down of the processes that are happening in the virtual. And the actualization, the mushroom, is not void of the virtual. The virtual is is constantly surrounding the mushroom like a cloud, like an electron cloud would surround a particle, an atom, right? So there's constantly processes that are deterritorializing the mushroom. So the mushroom is fruiting, is sprouting, and then it eventually dies. So this virtual actual relationship is constantly in process. Another way to think about this idea is a thought. What is a thought? A thought manifests in a brain. The thought is the actualization of the virtual processes of neuronal networks firing and relating with each other in different various speeds and intensities, eventually leading to a thought or an idea that forms. Now, the idea or the thought, the words that I'm speaking now are actualizations of the virtual field of relationships, of differential relations that are happening not only just in the brain, but also in what's behind me, right? So the books that I've read, the schooling that I've had, the upbringing, my parents, the place that I came from, the thoughts and the emotions and the hopes and the fears and the dreams, the past memories, the future, all of these, are a network, a vast network of differential relations again that end up coming together in the event of coming up and speaking, of sharing an idea, of sharing an opinion, of having a conversation, right? So these are events that are they actualize the virtual. You can continue with that and think of all the different ways, the different types of school, whether you went to college or not, what class you're in, whether your family was poor or rich, all of these different relationships that are hard to quantify make up not only a thought, but an ego, a person, a personality. An ego structure is an actualization of the virtual structures that or the virtual processes that we were just talking about, the field of relationships that make up someone's ego, which is constantly changing, constantly shifting. Subpersonalities made up of traumatic and ecstatic experiences make up someone's personality. And you can think of having a conversation with someone, and then let's say it's a good friend, you've known them for years, then you don't see them for 5, 6, 7 years, then you have a conversation with them. Are they the same person? No, they're not. They could have went to therapy. They could have had something tragic happened, right? So there's always a subterranean network field of relationships that are constantly at play in someone's personality, so to speak. I'll try to articulate this one a little bit, and it's about the protests that are happening right now, or that have been happening in the United States. So what is the manifestation of the protest? The protest was sparked through the event of the death of George Floyd. But where did this energy and this tension come from? It lives in the virtual. It's the virtual field of relationships that take on economic, political, social, technological dimensions. The intensity that's been going on with the coronavirus globally, people being in lockdown, people losing their jobs, people becoming more intensified in their addictions or their neuroses. All of this adds up. All of this is which are hard to quantify. They're more like speeds. They're more like movements that are hard to quantify. But when you look at the eruption of the protest, that is the actualization of the virtual field that has been perturbed by the event of the death of George Floyd. So that's just I'm kind of riffing a little bit there to give a little bit of an introduction to this concept. So I'm going to move in here to the book where there's going to be a quote here from Deleuze, Deleuze and Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus. And then DeLanda is going to go through a few of these concepts and give his kind of interpretation, his understanding of it. So these are not, what I'm talking about here is not some definitive definition of what these concepts are. They are what they are right now as I'm thinking about them, as I am speaking them. And the way that the concepts throughout his work have worked on me have been quite fascinating. So they really, when you engage with them, they change your cognition. You read Deleuze, you go and live life, and you come back to the text, and you come back a different person. You see things differently. It kind of opens things up in a sense, in a very interesting way, I think. So the metallic assemblages, that is what the chapter is called. And an assemblage, I like to think of it as a fractal, right? So a fractal is a set of nested patterns which manifest themselves at different levels, whether it's the individual, the collective, the societal. You have an individual cell, which is part of, an organ, which is part of a body, which is part of a family, right? So you have these different fractal patterns all the way up and down. Now Deleuze talks about these patterns in an immanent way. There's no transcendence in a sense, and that's where the concept of assemblage comes from. It's an assemblage of disparate, heterogeneous parts that emerge and make up a whole, make up something new, something novel. So here we go with the quote. This is from A Thousand Plateaus. The political, economic, and social regime of the peoples of the steppe. Now, the steppe is the grassland. You can think of when the monkeys came from the forest, they entered the grassland, and that is the idea of the steppe, right? And you'll see that this will be fleshed out a little bit more here. The political, economic, and social regime of the peoples of the steppe are less well known than their innovations in war, in the areas of offense and defense, defensive weapons, composition or strategy, and technological elements, the saddle, the stirrup, horseshoe, harness, etc. History contests each innovation but cannot succeed in effacing the nomad traces. What the nomads invented was the man-animal weapon, man-horse-bow assemblage. Through this assemblage of speed, the ages of metal are marked by innovation. The socketed bronze battle axe of the Hyksos and the iron sword of the Hittites have been compared to miniature atomic bombs. It is commonly agreed that the nomads lost their role as innovators with the advent of firearms, in particular the cannon. But it was not because they did not know how to use them. Not only did armies like the Turkish army, whose nomadic traditions remained strong, develop extensive firepower, a new space, but additionally, and even more characteristically, mobile artillery was thoroughly integrated into mobile formations of wagons, pirate ships, etc. If the cannon marks a limit for the nomads, it is on the contrary because it implies an economic investment that only a state apparatus can make. Even commercial cities do not suffice. And now here's DeLanda's kind of interpretation here. So, the whole composed of a human being, a fast-riding horse, and a missile-throwing weapon like a bow is probably the best-known example of an assemblage of heterogeneous elements, cutting as it does across entirely different realms of reality: the personal, the biological, and the technological. So here you see the fractal nature of the term assemblage. This emergent whole is itself composable into larger assemblages: a nomad army, an assemblage of mobile cavalry formations in which the components can fight alone or coalesce into teams, variably adjusting to the conditions in the battlefield. By contrast, the kind of military assemblage that sedentary peoples created, so nomad peoples are constantly moving, sedentary people are obviously sedentary. Sedentary peoples created, such as the phalanx, was an inflexible block of infantry soldiers that could exercise no initiative in the battlefield and was therefore hard to control once the order to attack had been given. This distinction between nomad and sedentary military assemblages, one more flexible or deterritorialized, the other more rigid or territorialized, should not be taken to imply the existence of two general categories of armies. Rather, the degree of territorialization or deterritorialization should be treated as a variable parameter that can change historically. So these concepts here of territorialization and deterritorialization, I have this example that I have in my head of a skateboard being a re-territorialized surfboard, right? So it's kind of this way of riding a wave, this way of this certain type of motion, this type of speed and comportment that was created with the surfboard is kind of recapitulated in a different environment. Rather than in the ocean, you're on the street, and in a way, it's deterritorialized and then reterritorialized as a skateboard. So this just a just an example. The sedentary armies of Europe, for example, underwent a gradual nomadization in the last 400 years. Their phalanxes were first flattened in the 16th century from the original eight men deep formation to 3 men deep. They were then given more flexibility during the Napoleonic Wars, and they were finally broken down during World War II into relatively autonomous platoons capable of making tactical decisions on their own. This process of deterritorialization was caused by the steady pressure of more powerful and mechanized fire weapons, like the rifle and the machine gun, that made fighting in tight formations increasingly costly, as well as by the availability of portable radio allowing the articulation of many platoons through a wireless chain of command. An army, sedentary or nomadic, should be viewed as an assemblage of assemblages. That is, as an entity produced by the recursive application of the part-to-whole relation. A nomad army is composed of many interacting cavalry teams, themselves composed of human horse-bow assemblages, in turn made out of human, animal, and technical components. Similarly, and simplifying it a bit, a modern army is composed of many platoons, composed of many human rifle radio assemblages, the human and technical components of which are themselves assemblages. So again, fractal all the way up and down. At any level of such a nested set of assemblages, causality operates in 2 directions at once: the bottom-up effect of the parts on the whole and the top-down effect of the whole on its parts. On one hand, the properties and capacities of a whole emerge from the causal interactions between its parts. Many human horse-bow assemblages, trained intensively to work together, form a whole with the emergent capacity to take advantage of spatial features of the battlefield for ambush and surprise, and to exploit temporal features of the battle, such as the fleeting tactical opportunity presented by a temporary break in an enemy's formation. Because of this bottom-up causality, the emergent properties and capacities of a whole are immanent. Another concept that is used, one of the key and central concepts, is immanence. That is, they are irreducible to its parts, but do not transcend them, in the sense that if the parts stop interacting, the whole itself ceases to exist or becomes a mere aggregation of elements. On the other hand, once a whole emerges, it can exercise its capacities not only to interact with other wholes, as when 2 enemy armies face each other in battle, but to affect its own parts, constraining them and enabling them. Belonging to a team of warriors makes its members subject to mutual policing. Any loss of nerve or display of weakness by one of the members will be noticed by the rest of the team and affect his or her reputation. But the team also creates resources for its members as they compensate for each other's weaknesses and amplify each other's strengths. The existence of bottom-up and top-down forms of causality implies that the evolution of the components of an assemblage at any given level of scale will be partly autonomous and partly influenced by the environment created by the larger assemblages itself. Whether a particular technical object is used as a weapon or as a tool, for example, is in some cases determined by top-down causality. Let's take the example of a community of hunter-gatherers, that is, the communal assemblage of which human beings and its pre-modern ancestors were component parts for hundreds or thousands of years. Hundreds of thousands of years. In this assemblage, there was not only a division of labor, but also communal monitoring of behavior. A community as a whole could enforce a more or less egalitarian distribution of the spoils of the hunt. This means that even though for most of this time humans did not possess language, they were already fully artifacts. We can imagine that in the daily life of a hunter-gatherer community, these stone artifacts were tools used to hunt as well as to butcher and skin the carcass. But that when one community faced another in violent conflict, the same object became a weapon. That is, the object's properties remained the same, but it was used in a very different way, not directed with controlled movements towards a carcass, but projected towards or even thrown at an enemy. In other words, the communal assemblage selected some capacities of the stone artifacts when in work mode and other capacities when in war mode. All right, as Deleuze and Guattari write here, quote, the principle behind all technology is to demonstrate that a technical element remains abstract, entirely undetermined, as long as one does not relate it to an assemblage it presupposes. It is the machine that is primary in relation to the technical element. not the technical machine itself, a collection of elements, but the social or collective machine, that the machine assemblage that determines what is technical, what is a technical element of a given moment, what is its usage, its extension, its comprehension. End quote. Expressing the reality of top-down causality this way is problematic because it seems to deny any autonomy to the components of an assemblage. As the above quote continues, for example, Deleuze and Guattari assert that, quote, technical objects have no distinctive intrinsic characteristics, end quote. If by that one means that there is not a set of necessary and sufficient characteristics that unambiguously characterizes weapons and tools in general, then I agree with that assertion. Entities like, quote-unquote, the weapon and the, quote-unquote, tool are only reified generalities and as such have no place in assemblage theory. But expressing this by saying that a technical object outside a larger assemblage remains entirely undetermined risks transforming the concept of assemblage into something like a Hegelian totality, in which the very identity of the parts is constituted by their relations in the whole. To avoid this danger, it is important to distinguish two different ways in which technical objects may be characterized, by their properties and by their capacities. So now DeLanda is going to bring in the example of a knife, and I think it's one of his clearest examples of how to understand this this differentiation between an assemblage's the properties and their capacities, right? So let's use a knife as an example. Its properties include its length, weight, sharpness. These properties characterize the more or less enduring states of the knife and are therefore always actual. So these are the quantifiable, actual characteristics of the knife. At any one point in time, a knife is either sharp or blunt. A sharp knife, on the other hand, also has capacities, like its capacity to cut. Unlike sharpness, the capacity to cut need not be actual. If the knife is not presently cutting something and may never become actual if the knife is never used. And when a capacity does not become actual, it is never as an enduring state, but as a more or less instantaneous event. Moreover, this event is always double, to cut, be cut, because the capacity to affect must always be coupled to a capacity to be affected. Deleuze talks about this in terms of affect, which is DeLanda explicates more, and he breaks it down to the ability to affect and be affected. So where was I here? A particular knife may be able to cut through bread, cheese, paper, or even wood, but not through a solid brick of titanium. This implies that while properties are finite and may be put into a closed list, capacities to affect may not be fully enumerated because they depend on a potentially infinite number of capacities to be affected. Thus, a knife may not only have a capacity to cut, but also a capacity to kill. If it happens to interact with a large enough organism with differentiated organs, that is, with an entity having the capacity to be killed. The assertion that a particular technical object is a tool or a weapon, depending on the larger assemblage of which it is part, could then be interpreted as meaning that a knife, as used in a kitchen assemblage, is a tool, the assemblage selecting from all its capacities only the ability to cut, while the same knife in army assemblage becomes a weapon, the assemblage selecting its ability to kill. Yet this would not imply that the properties of the knife are determined by the larger assemblage. Those properties, on the contrary, emerge from the interactions between a knife's own components. The sharpness of its blade, for example, is a geometric property of the cross-section of the blade, its triangular or pointy form, a property that emerges from a particular arrangement of its component crystals. And similarly, for larger assemblages, a sword, a human being, and a horse must exercise certain causal capacities as they interact with each other for the man-horse-weapon assemblage to have emergent properties. The human must ride the horse to acquire its momentum, its larger mass multiplied by its faster speed, and must hold a weapon firmly in hand to transmit the momentum to it. But once the assemblage emerges, it constrains its components, discarding some capacities, the capacity of the rider to be compassionate, the capacity of the horse to pull carriages, the capacity of the sword to be used as a tool, and selecting for others, fighting skills, rapid movement, projected motion. Whereas the stone artifacts of hunter-gatherers may indeed be viewed as relatively undetermined, the same object having two different uses within a community and between conflicting communities, once tools and weapons differentiated in form and function, they acquired a certain autonomy. No doubt the progressive differentiation of technical objects was guided by the differentiated social assemblages, farms, armies, workshops, temples, of which they were parts. But they nevertheless retained their own properties, a fact that explains, for example, that they could be detached from one assemblage and plugged into another, as when fire weapons were transferred from sedentary armies to nomad ones. And technical objects can be said to have their own history, in the sense that the pace of technological development may pick up speed, accelerating relative to that institutional development and forcing the latter to catch up. That seems to be the case with rifles and machine guns, the lethal capacity of which demanded a break with tight formations, a demand that went unsatisfied for more than a century as armies lagged behind technology, unable to reform themselves and adapt to the new conditions on the battlefield. But while distinguishing properties from capacities may help us to correctly interpret the quote above, there is another problem with it that is not so easy to solve. The fact that Deleuze and Guattari seem to be using two incompatible definitions of the term assemblage. In his own text, Deleuze uses the term to refer not only to social assemblages, like a man-horse weapon assemblage, but also to biological ones, the wasp-orchid symbiotic assemblage, and even non-organic ones, like the assemblage formed by copper and tin when they interact to form an alloy, bronze, with its own emergent properties and capacities. But in his joint work with Guattari, the term refers only to social assemblages. Thus, an army is both a machinic assemblage, or an intermingling of material bodies, human, animal, technical bodies, as well as a collective assemblage of enunciation, that is, a whole in which statements have the capacity to create social obligations, like the commands that flow downwards in an army hierarchy or the reports that flow upwards. In this second sense, the term assemblage is not only restricted to social wholes, since only in them can statements be speech acts, but it applies to only one level of scale. A different term is used to refer to the components of an assemblage, bodies, another term to refer to larger social wholes that assemblages form, the social field or the socius. Thus, whereas in the first definition, the components of man-horse weapon assemblage can themselves be viewed as assemblages, in the second, they cannot. Again, this is DeLanda's interpretation there. In my own work, I have solved this ambiguity by always using the first definition while trying to capture the content of the second one through the distinction between the material, the expressive components of an assemblage, the latter including not only statements and the speech acts of which they are capable, but also components capable of non-linguistic forms of expression. Furthermore, while Deleuze includes in the first definition the requirement that the components be heterogeneous, using a term stratum to refer to wholes with homogeneous components, I have modified the concept by parameterizing it, that is, by building into it control knobs with variable settings quantifying the degree of homogeneity or heterogeneity of the components, or the degree to which the assemblage's identity is rigidly or flexibly determined. Thus, as the opening paragraph of this essay indicates, I do not treat nomad and sedentary armies as two different categories, but as two assemblages in which this parameter has different settings, quantifying two different degrees of territorialization. As the parameter changed under the pressure of faster and more accurate firearms, the phalanx was nomadized, that is, it was deterritorialized. So that last sentence here is a good example of deterritorialization and how the virtual intensities of speed and pressure over time cause actual structures like the phalanx to be deterritorialized. Let me read that sentence again. As the parameter changed under the pressure of faster and more accurate firearms, the phalanx was nomadized, that is, it was deterritorialized. It may be objected that parameterizing the concept of assemblage cannot replace the dichotomy stratum assemblage because, After all, variations in a parameter can cause only quantitative changes, whereas the use of two different categories indicates a commitment to the existence of qualitative differences. This is more an apparent than a real problem, as can be seen by examining the use of parameters in mathematical models or experimental situations in the realm of physics, chemistry, or biology. In these fields, a parameter, when it quantifies an intensive property, is characterized by critical points of intensity that mark sudden changes in quality. Let's take the example of speed. In fluid materials, changes in this intensive parameter causes qualitative changes in regime of flow. At slow speeds, a fluid tends to move in a uniform manner called laminar flow. But at a critical point in speed, this regime is replaced by a qualitatively different one, a coherent circular motion called convective flow, which is in turn replaced at another critical point by a regime called turbulent flow. These three regimes exemplify the emergence of qualitatively distinct phases that cannot be confused with general categories of flow. Turbulence in particular, with its complex structure of vortices within vortices, is often used by Deleuze and Guattari as a model for qualitatively distinct regime or zones of intensity. That's another concept being worked out here is the process of singularity, or the phase space changes. Another example that I like to use is the phase change of water from liquid to from solid ice to liquid water to gas, right? So the differences in temperature and pressure and density, these are the qualitative, these are the virtual intensive processes that once reach a critical threshold, the boiling point of water, you have a phase transition, you have a qualitative shift in the material object, in this case, water. So here's a quote from Deleuze and Guattari as a model for a qualitatively distinct regime or zone of intensity, as they write, quote, "It is thus necessary to make a distinction between speed and movement. Movement may be very fast, but that does not give it speed. A speed may be very slow or even immobile, yet it is still speed. Movement is the extensive, actual. Speed is intensive, virtual." I added those connotations there. Movement designates the relative character of a body considered as quote-unquote one, and which goes from point to point. Speed, on the contrary, constitutes the absolute character of a body whose irreducible parts, atoms, occupy or fill a smooth space in the manner of a vortex, with the possibility of springing up at any point. It is therefore not surprising that reference has been made to spiritual voyages effected without relative movements, but in intensity, in one place. These are also part of nomadism, end quote. Phase transitions driven by a speed parameter also occur in biology. Take, for example, one of the components of the man-horse weapon assemblage. As a quadruped animal, a horse's manner of moving, its gait, spontaneously undergoes qualitative changes at critical points of speed. At low intensity values of this parameter, the horse walks. At faster values, it trots. And to reach even higher speeds, the horse is forced to break into a gallop. Speed is also important when analyzing larger assemblages, the difference in the quality of motion between the rapid charge of cavalry formations and the slow march of a phalanx being rather obvious. But the parameter we need to quantify degrees of territorialization and deterritorialization in military assemblages is a complex function of speed and other variable properties. For example, the parameter must also quantify the degree to which decision-making is centralized or decentralized in an army, since allowing warriors to display more initiative in the battlefield is what made nomad armies capable to take advantage of topographical variations in the battlefield and adjust to the temporal variability of the battle itself. In Napoleonic armies, for example, an increase in speed and mobility was coupled to a more flexible chain of command. The degree of intensity of centralization of command was also crucial for the emergence of the semi-autonomous platoon. Thresholds of decision-making were lowered, allowing troops on the ground to make tactical decisions while their commanders set only overall strategic goals. Replacing general terms, assemblage stratum, with a single parameterized concept is justified in a materialist philosophy, not only to purge reified categories from its ontology, but also because the different regimes or phases into which the space of possible parameters values is divided can be transformed into each other. This allows historical analysis to account for the fact that assemblages of soldiers can become assemblages of workers, as when an army besieging a city must become sedentary and dedicate most of its time to logistical labor. As Deleuze and Guattari put it, quote, but it is not impossible for weapons and tools, if they are taken up by new assemblages of metamorphosis, to enter into the relations of alliance. The man of war may at times form peasant or worker alliances, but it is more frequent for a worker, industrial or agricultural, to reinvent a war machine. End quote. In addition, replacing categories with regimes or phases can help eliminate certain paradoxical or even problematic aspects in Deleuze and Guattari's argument. In particular, they constantly express admiration for the war machine, particularly when they oppose it to the state apparatus, that is, to a highly territorialized and coded assemblage of government organizations. But this constant praise should not be taken to imply that they view any particular military assemblage, not even one composed of nomad warriors whose legendary cruelty is well known, as a model for a better social order, and certainly not to imply approval or commendation for war itself. Rather, as a name for a phase or a zone of intensity in the space of possible values for the control parameter, the term war machine refers to a special regime in the operation of any organizational assemblage, a regime in which the organization displays a capacity to operate in continuous variation. That's a great sentence in explaining the concept of war machine, which is used throughout Deleuze and Guattari's work. It's clarifying. Let me read it again here. So rather, as a name for a phase or a zone of intensity in a space of possible values for the control parameter, the term war machine refers to a special regime in the operation of an organizational assemblage, a regime in which the organization displays a capacity to operate in continuous variation. Much as regimes of flow, like convection or turbulence, can exist in a wide variety of fluid substances from air and water to molten rock, the regimes into which critical points break the parameter space for organizations possess a certain universality, that is, they can be actualized in different organizations. In fact, Deleuze and Guattari use the term war machine and nomadic to refer to many other assemblages, including bodies of knowledge and the organizations in which they are produced. In this sense, for example, they speak of nomad sciences as fields of knowledge production that effectuate the war machine. They contrast these fields to those of sedentary or royal sciences that they postulate occupy a zone of intensity in parameter space neighboring that of the state apparatus, that is, a highly territorialized and coded regime. This just brought up the idea of what's happening right now with institutions across the globe, especially institutions like the WHO, even the CDC, which we are seeing become deterritorialized by the speed of information that's being processed across cell towers, across computers, across people, across the globe in such a rapid sense that the sense-making, the territorializing apparatus of the body that is the WHO is being deterritorialized. So I think that's a good example that just came up. So the Deleuze and Guattari have these two concepts that were just discussed here, royal science and nomadic science. Royal science would be the institution. Eric Weinstein has a term called the gated institution narrative, I think it is, right? Where it keeps information from coming in, even though the information is valid, truthful, helpful, useful, even revolutionary. It keeps that information from coming in to keep the status quo, to keep the territory as it is for as long as possible. The royal science would be the WHO. Nomadic science would be different groups, individuals or groups that are doing experiments and that are providing information that would deterritorialize or disintegrate the institutions. This is just, it's happening. We're seeing it happen with the police institutions across the United States right now. I think we're seeing it with political parties. We're seeing the Democrat Party and the Republican Party. They're essentially inverting as they're trying to hold on to the territory that they have that is literally disintegrating in front of our eyes. We are in a very liminal place right now here in 2020, where the old broadcast, the old ways of information exchange, the old ways of institutions are changing into something new, yet we have not crossed the threshold, the critical threshold of the phase transition. We are in that space between boiling and liquid water, in a sense. Sorry, I digress here. All right. Whereas sedentary fields of science search for the eternal and immutable laws of nature and treat matter as an obedient and domesticated substrate that faithfully follows those laws, nomad sciences treat matter not as an inert receptacle for forms that come from the outside, as in the so-called hylomorphic model, but as an animated from within by its own tendencies and capacities. Deleuze and Guattari use the term affect or affected and the term singularity to refer to tendencies such as the tendency of iron to melt at 1,535 degrees centigrade. The term singular is used here not as the opposite of plural, but of ordinary, in the sense that in a line of temperature values, the points marking 1532, 1533, 1534, and many other degrees are ordinary. Nothing special happening at those points, while 1535 degrees is remarkable or singular. Moreover, 1535 degrees centigrade is only a constant if we use a single parameter, temperature, but it becomes a variable once we add a second parameter like pressure. Metallurgy is an example of a nomad science that Deleuze and Guattari discuss in most detail, partly because the blacksmith, as a producer of weapons, has had a long association with military assemblages, but also because metallurgy illustrates the special regime of deterritorialization that allows an organization, a workshop in this case, to feed on variation itself as opposed to subsist on a diet of constants, routines, and homogenized material behavior. As they write, quote, "It would be useless to say that metallurgy is a science because it discovers constant laws, for example, the melting point of a metal at all times and in all places. For metallurgy, as inseparable from several lines of variation between meteorites and indigenous metals, variation between ores and proportions of metal, variation between alloys, natural and artificial, variation between the qualities that make a given operation possible or that result from a given operation, all of these variables can be grouped under two overall rubrics: singularities or spatiotemporal haesities. It's another concept. Singularities or spatiotemporal haesities of different orders, and the operations associated with them as process of deformation or transformation, and affective qualities or traits of expression of different levels corresponding to these singularities and operations, hardness, weight, color, etc. Let us return to the example of the saber, or rather of crucible steel. It implies the actualization of a first singularity, namely the melting of the iron at high temperature, then a second singularity. The successive decarbonations corresponding to these singularities are traits of expression. Not only the hardness, sharpness, and finish, but also the undulations or designs traced by the crystallization and resulting from the internal organization of the cast steel. The iron sword is associated with entirely different singularities, because it is forged and not cast or molded, quenched and not air cooled, produced by the piece and not in number. Its traits of expression are necessarily very different because it pierces rather than hews, attacks from the front rather than from the side. End quote. In this quote, Deleuze and Guattari do not make a clear distinction between properties, weight, color, sharpness, and capacities, the different ways in which a weapon can cut flesh or attack an enemy. The reason may be that both properties and capacities can express the identity of a weapon, that is, they are both traits of expression. But as noted earlier in this essay, there is an important distinction that must be made here. Properties are always actual, whereas capacities can can be real but not actual if they are not currently being exercised. And similarly, for tendencies, which are also real even when not actually manifested, and which are always actualized as events. The difference between the saber and the sword as assemblages can then be established on the basis of a constellation of tendencies, capacities, and properties, or of singularities and traits of expression. As Deleuze and Guattari put it, quote, "We will call an assemblage every constellation of singularities and traits deducted from the flow, selected, organized, stratified in such a way as to converge artificially or naturally." With this definition, we can take the concept of assemblage to the very heart of matter. That is, we do not have to accept the requirement that all assemblages be quote-unquote collective assemblages of enunciation. Only that they all have expressive elements, whatever these may be. The crystalline sound of metals, their shine or gleam, but also the way they express what they can do as they exercise their electrical, mechanical, and chemical capacities, metallic effects. Chemically, metals are the second most powerful catalysts on the planet, losing only to biological enzymes. A catalyst is a molecular assemblage that can intervene in reality to increase or decrease the speed of a chemical reaction without itself being changed in the process. Electrically, metals are highly conductive and are used by animals in atomic or ionic form to animate their brains and other parts of their nervous system. Bringing assemblage theory down to the molecular or even atomic level promises to inject new life into a materialist philosophy, a genre that used to include only a small set of material entities, physical labor, the food, drink, clothing, and shelter needed to reproduce a workforce. The means of production. These entities are, of course, still very important in the new materialism, but now matter itself matters. To conclude with an eloquent quote from Deleuze and Guattari. In short, what metal and metallurgy bring to light is a life proper to matter, a vital state of matter as such, a material vitalism that doubtless exists everywhere but is ordinarily hidden or covered, rendered unrecognizable, disassociated by the hylomorphic model. Metallurgy is the consciousness or thought of the matter flow, and metal the correlate of that consciousness. Let me say that again. Metallurgy is the consciousness or thought of the matter flow, and metal the correlate of that consciousness. As expressed in panmetalism, metal is coextensive to the whole of matter, and the whole of matter to metallurgy. Even the waters, the grasses, and varieties of wood, the animals, are populated by salts or mineral elements. Not everything is metal, but metal is everywhere. End quote. Thanks for listening.